Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So this is Ebrahim. I'm a professor from electrical, computer, and biomedical engineering from Ryerson X University at downtown Toronto. Um, I work in broad areas of information retrieval and social analytics. I hold a Canada Research Chair in social information retrieval and a NSERC Industrial Research Chair in social media analytics. Um, and as we just mentioned, we started a new NSERC program on responsible development of AI, which is very relevant here. Um, what I plan to do is, if we have time left at the end, I'll go through our program and introduce, and if anyone's interested, get you on. But for the sake of this panel, I'd like to introduce our very esteemed panelists. And first, thank you for agreeing to join us today. I have in alphabetical order our panelists, Dan Adamson, Susanna Raj, and Eleni Strulia. Um, Dan Adamson is a co-founder. I guess everyone can see Dan. If you can wave, maybe Zoom will bring you up on the top. I don't know. So Dan is a co-founder and CEO of Armia.ai, a company helping institutions systematically validate their algorithmic decision-making with innovative technology. He also co-founded Point Chain Technologies and previously served as Outside IQ's founder and CEO until its acquisition in 2017, remaining to oversee AI research. He was previously the chief architect of MedStory, sold to Microsoft. Dan is an expert on vertical search and cognitive computing with more than 15 years in the industry. He holds several search algorithm and AI patents, has been named among the most influential must-see thought leaders in AI and fintech, in addition to being a recipient of numerous academic awards and holding a Master of Science from UC Berkeley. So welcome, Dan. Susanna Raj is a founder and CEO of AI for Nomads. Hi, Susanna. Maybe you can wave. A public benefit corporation, the first online platform that lets everyone label data to train AI on a phone and get paid. She believes in harnessing the power of AI to eradicate poverty and digital literacy around the globe, aligned with United Nations Sustainable Goals for 2030. She's an independent cognitive science and AI ethics researcher. Her background is in psychology, studio arts, and human-computer interaction. Susanna is a nationally recognized public speaker, instructor at business school, and an effective computing researcher with 7 years of experience. Previously, a researcher at Intel, anticipatory computing lab, and a language data collection researcher at Amazon. She's an ACM, NeurIPS, WIML published researcher, a prolific writer, and an established studio artist, a vocal advocate of ethical and inclusive AI and fairness in data collection. In her spare time, she volunteers for many organizations that align with her values of building beneficial solutions for society's problems. Welcome, Susanna. Of course, last but not least, Dr. Eleni Strulia, maybe Eleni, yeah, there she is a professor in the Department of Computing Science at the University of Alberta from 2011 to 2016. She held the NSERC AITF Industrial Research Chair on Service Systems Management with IBM. Her research focuses on addressing industry-driven problems, adopting AI and machine learning methods to improve or automate tasks. Her flagship project in the area of healthcare is the Smart Condo, in which she investigates the use of technology to support people with chronic conditions live independently longer and to educate health science students to provide better care for these clients. In 2011, the Smart Condo team received the U of A Teaching Unit Award. She has played leadership roles in GRAND and AgeWell Network of Centers of Excellence. These are very well-known and influential centers in Canada. In 2018, she received the McCullough Professorship, and in 2019, she was recognized with the Killam Award for Excellence in Mentoring. She has supervised more than 60 graduate students in PDFs who have gone forward to stellar academic and industrial careers. Since 2020, she's the director of the University of Alberta's AI for Society signature area, and she's serving as the acting vice dean of the Faculty of Science at the University of Alberta. So welcome, Eleni. I think the plan for us is to have each of our panelists present for around 10 minutes. Given I started alphabetically in the introductions, maybe we can go reverse order with presentations, starting with Eleni, if that's okay, Eleni, with you.
Now you tell me. I know that's perfectly fine, but I love the surprise. So let me start sharing my screen.
I have to stop, so I'm just stopping my screen share.
Okay. Am I doing this right?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So it is such an honor and pleasure to be part of this panel. And thank you, Valentin and Ebrahim, for inviting me. When I started thinking about what I wanted to talk about, the topic of ethics and bias and fairness is so broad. I wanted to think about a specific domain where bias is a problem. And gender is something that I have been thinking about for a long time throughout my career, being a woman in computing science. So I figure I'll talk about sexism in AI. So AI is sexist and it shouldn't be. So here's, we should fix it. It's a problem that needs to be addressed. It is an instance of the general bias problem, but it is particularly prevalent and offensive to me. So when I started thinking about this notion of gender, I did a very quick study of Twitter last December, and we used two sets of keywords. One was AI and the other was ethics, and we looked at tweets that had both of them. And then we saw gender pop up in the conversation quite prevalent. As you can see, people are talking about women in tech, EPI, women in STEM, diversity, girls fly too, gender, girls who code. So this is really something that's prominent in the conversation. That's a little bit of a sanity check on my own choice of what is interesting. And in this context, I want to talk about how AI systematizes, mirrors, and amplifies our own biases. So the first issue is systematizing, and it's kind of obvious what's going on. The moment you have a software system mediating an activity, this activity becomes stringent, possibly brittle, more consistent on the positive side. And there are positive and negative aspects to systematization. The positive aspects are consistency. There used to be noise in every individual's judgment when the individual was responsible for executing a procedure that was documented in natural language only. So imagine procedures about, let's say, getting a loan or deciding whether somebody is deserving of a social benefit. Now, when the rules are codified, things become more consistent. At the same time, this notion of consistency comes at the cost of losing context. In order to describe a solution, we have to circumscribe the problem, and therefore subtleties that could potentially have been understood by a single individual asking further questions are lost. And because the system is taking care of the process, we have an appearance of objectivity, and somehow the appeal, when a decision is not necessarily valid, may be rejected a little bit too easily. Now, a very interesting initiative that's going on today across the world and in Canada is this notion of rules as code. And this is an initiative of our government trying to codify rules for particular social services and basically develop these regulations as born in code. So where we would have regulators discuss in English and in French, writing two versions of the same regulation, the same piece of regulation legislation, we have people working with computer scientists defining this in code. And this has the potential of actually codifying and systematizing things that are affecting a huge audience. And it can be a hugely positive initiative, and it can be fundamentally problematic if we lose these subtleties. Now, the more interesting problem, I think, is the mirroring part. And if we think about AI systems in two broad categories, systems that are engineered, developed on first principles, and systems that are data-driven, we can see our biases in both categories. In the engineered side, it is important to remember that most of the engineers, most of the computing science professionals, software engineers are men. I have gotten these numbers from a recent document on the McKinsey report, and I'm sure I cannot defend them very well, but they say that 20% of the technical employees in machine learning companies are women, 12% of AI researchers are women, and only 6% of AI developers are women. So therefore, the result of not having women involved in the engineering of AI systems has consequences like the following. Lina is the image that has been used traditionally by computer vision since the late 70s to evaluate computer vision and machine learning algorithms. And it just so happens that it's November 72 Playboy centerfold. And that's not particularly offensive. Lina's face is shown in it, but this indicates something about the culture. And I can imagine jokes about this picture. Now we have humanoid AI, chatbots and robots, and it just so happens that all the companions are women, only the rescue machines look male. So the first chatbot was Eliza, she was a woman. Professor Seguro built Erica, and he stated that his objective was to build the most beautiful woman, and she goes from subtle and companion to sassy and sexy. And that's the range of human expression that we see in that robot. And as sort of a funny problem is the 2014 Apple's Health Kit that could monitor copper intake, but not menstrual cycles. So copper intake, I'm sure, is very important in our lives, but I'm sure menstrual cycles are much more of interest to much bigger aspect of our population than copper. And this only gets worse in data-driven systems. In data-driven systems, if you consider the whole pipeline of how machine learning works, you have data collection, data labeling, maybe you have feature selection, and you have algorithms that work to optimize different functions. To begin with, the data is skewed. So I read a very interesting story about the human of reference, and the human of reference apparently is a 25-year-old male that's about 75 kilograms. And that, this is mentioned by Caroline Criado Perez, a feminist machine learning futurist author. And basically the reason why this is the human of reference is many of the psychology programs appeal to first-year psychology students in universities. Many of the subjects of clinical studies are men. I point you to the John Oliver show on bias in medicine, where basically he says that there was a cancer study for the impact of diet on estrogen metabolism and the links of this to cancer of breast and uterus, and all the subjects were men. So if you have these kinds of data sets, then the intelligence that will be extracted is fundamentally problematic in itself, but definitely problematic for 50% of the world's population that are about women. And then we have the issue of labeling. Up until recently, most of our university systems only knew male and female. They did not even have the prefer not to disclose. And so we don't even know what this data represents. There's huge noise. And sometimes, even if we have the ability to relabel the data, the labelers can be mostly male, in which case bias creeps in through the labeling process. And even if we manage to get well-representative data of the whole population with proper labels that recognize the categories and the intersectionality of the categories, then we have feature selection. And there are two fundamental ways of doing feature selection. Either domain experts select the most important features, or you have some kind of dimensionality reduction process that is also subject to bias because the original data is skewed. So when we do dimensionality reduction, we eliminate features that seem to track other features, and that may only be the case, that may only be true in our particular skewed data set. And finally, after we have selected the features and start applying the machine learning algorithm, all of these algorithms have some evaluation, some objective function that they try to optimize. And after they have produced the results, we as researchers use evaluation metrics. And the question is that there's a huge variety of evaluation metrics, and they don't actually all come up with, they're not fair. So as an example, I was looking at a study that basically was looking at predicting recidivism of people in prisons or getting out of prisons. And what was found is that the false positive rate was twice as much for white defendants, but the true positive rate was fair. So the true positive was the same for white and African-American defendants, but the false positive, basically the likelihood that somebody would falsely be identified as potential recidivism risk, was much higher for African Americans. So even our way of evaluating our processes can be fundamentally unfair. And we always have to be thoughtful about what we're choosing as the measure of success and fairness. Finally, the whole problem becomes big because systems can have much larger impact than any individual human. So a successful system can be adopted across a whole sector. The same software can enforce its biases on a large number of organizations. So there is an apocryphal story, I couldn't find the reference, that the same CV reading software is used by most Fortune 100 companies, which means that if you're not successful in one, you will be excluded by all. So the impact is huge. Some just important stories. Female frontline health workers are more exposed to COVID-19 because of unisex personal protective equipment. A woman wearing a seatbelt is 47% more likely to be seriously injured than a man. And that's because all our tests are with manly dummies, quote unquote. And this AI opportunity is leaving many women out of jobs, and it would have a disproportionate impact to women because they're working in jobs that would be easy to replace with AI. So what we could be doing is working on both the technical and the governance fronts. On the technical side, data sheets would be required, should be required for any software system that actually makes real decisions in the real world. And the data sheet should explain how the data was collected and how it represents the population about which it makes decisions. Explainable AI is pushing for understanding this black box of the pipeline, and different testing mechanisms would advance the opportunity for the public to trust the decisions offered by our systems. And the most important thing, in my opinion, especially if you're thinking about gender, is that all of our systems should be evaluated intersectionally, and all metrics should be reported across different demographic categories. On the governance side, it's very difficult to follow up from Yosha Bengio, but basically certification is and regulation are important. We see that there are many outfits looking for certification programs. I'm just mentioning Responsible AI will happen to work with them, but there are many, many initiatives that are designing procedures that would give a ranking on the quality of the machine learning process that a product has been developed with. And then we need government regulation. So GDPR in Europe seems to be a little bit ahead of the whole world. And GDPR starts with 4 principles: respect for human autonomy, prevention of harm, fairness, and explicability. So I see this notion of fairness and explanation being hand in hand, because there's no way that we can argue that something is fair if we cannot explain how it was produced and how it performs across different categories on the audience to which it's applied. And for that, I want to conclude and look forward to hear from Dan and Susanna. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Eleni. I already have like a ton of questions, but I'll withhold. Susanna, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Sure, let me. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Okay.
Yes, yes.
So this was this is such an important topic that you guys are discussing here about the inclusion of different genders, inclusion of different perspectives. So this was based on a introductory call with Valentine. I just tried to introduce myself in less than 3 minutes and give an overview of how I came into AI and AI ethics. So this is just a presentation on that, the march of the multi-potentialities into AI. What is a multi-potentiality? It's a psychological term. It's a very complex term that says that you're interested in multiple things, but also able to excel in more than one. And that, that is actually a personality or a character trait of some people. But it might be too complicated to understand. But this is the most colloquial way I can, explain what a multipotentiality is. It's a group of humans who look like this when you ask the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? We just don't have an answer for it. And because we just look very shocked. Do I have to pick one? Can I just pick more than one? Can I be everything? Is it not possible? And this dilemma, follows us throughout our whole life, because even while putting this slideshow, I couldn't pick one baby's picture. All three of them looked so cute, and I had to put all of three of them there, even though one could have been fine. So naturally, people like us, we study psychology and art. If you ask me why, it it just made more sense to me to study the oldest field of human behavior, and also combine that with art, which is something I have been doing since I was born. And it seemed like, might as well get a degree in that as well. So that is that is basically the theory behind my studies. And naturally, we study psychology and art, and then a multi-potentiality person goes and works in AI, because it just makes perfect sense to us. There is absolutely no connection between what I studied and what I did, but it just happened that way, and I managed to excel in all of them. And that's where, that's while working at Intel. I got this internship at Intel, and while I was working there with autonomous vehicles, and trying to teach AI to understand human emotions so that the autonomous vehicle can understand the humans inside the car, I found out that AI has, a huge diversity problem and a major ethics problem. Literally, it's like that red car in there. That's how many psychologists you will find in a technology company, and that's how many anthropologists or artists, or even the number of women. Maybe it will be just one of those white cars. Our numbers are so small within the tech industry, but the value that we add to this dialogue, and especially to the problems that are seen with AI, is so huge that it is time that we started talking about this, and we started building more representation within this field. So after my start stint at Intel, and then working at Amazon, and trying to find out what this thing called AI ethics is, and why is AI having so many problems in data bias in the pipeline, in the AI/ML machine pipeline, especially in data collection, data labeling. I just felt like the problem to me was so obvious, because bias is not a new problem, because AI is trained with human data, and human data always had bias. And bias was both good and both bad. So it is an ancient entity, but it just found new use cases in AI. So the idea that human data is the data that AI is being trained with, therefore it requires all these fields, especially the field of psychology, which is 200 years old, and art, which is 40,000 years old. And AI, in comparison, is only 65 years old. So it's just a baby that's trying to walk and talk. And of course, it's going to see problems in there, and it requires the perspectives of everyone who has studied in all these other disciplines to come and work there. It actually needs more people who can think in non-linear ways. So in terms of looking at data bias, I am now an instructor on data bias in the data ML pipeline. I have worked with many organizations that actually cover this issue. And my goal is to make people see that this is not an AI problem, like a technical problem that needs to be solved, but it has solutions already within the world. Like a baby at 9 months old can tell the difference between a real object and one in the book, but a test still has trouble telling a sticker stop sign from a real one. And so this is not it's not about, oh, Tesla is trained on biased data and Tesla needs to be trained on this way or that way. You just have to look for solutions in fields that are already old enough to have found out those solutions for you, and bring our perspectives to the table. And with that, I would like to say that, it needs artists, psychologists, anthropologists, the entire humanities and liberal arts, along with technologists. And just like Elena said, gender representation. All of those things in AI is so important. And there is no such thing as a hard versus soft skill in any fields of study. That's a myth. And we need STEM in AI, and STEM in AI has many definitions, but one of the organizations where I volunteer most of my time has come up with this new definition, which includes science and sociology, technology, technical education, engineering, ethics, arts and analytics, mathematics and mentoring. And they have put together a whole amazing program around it. And I would love for all of you to come and join and work within this grassroots community and many others like this to help bring more representation into this new field. I believe the age of cognitive diversity is here. That is why I'm so proud to be called a woman in arts, woman in AI, woman in AI ethics, woman in STEM, and a founder of an AI startup. So that is the end of my presentation. If you guys have any questions, I would love to answer that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Susanna. Excellent. I think there will be a lot of discussions around what you mentioned, but we'll go to Dan and then we'll start our discussions after that. Dan, if you're ready, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'll share my screen here. First of all, thank you for having me here. I think this is obviously a really important topic. So I'm very excited to talk about it. Here we go. Can you see my slides, hopefully? Great. So I'll go really quickly here. I do just want to quickly talk a little bit about what we're doing, but more my background. I think, I have deployed, we've deployed mostly models or AI systems to large global banks, financial institutions throughout the world. I think upwards of over 100. As part of that, we've had a lot of practical experience, and so I want to relay some of our findings here. And the field is advancing quickly, obviously, and there's been a lot of great conversation already about where we are. But I do want to sort of ground in some sort of from the ground experience here. This is nothing new, but it is getting scarier in a sense, right? There's been statistics since way back, right? And they've been used for good and bad since way back. And then we entered this algorithmic era, and Kathy O'Neill had a great book and a lot around the dangers of algorithms. So this is nothing new, but we've entered yet this new era, right, of machine learning and AI, where actually often these approaches are more black box, right? They're less transparent, and often they're learning, meaning what you put in towards this journal of irreproducible results, it might learn from it and come up with a different outcome, right, the next day. So this makes things even riskier and harder to control. Software has come a long way in terms of its ability to QA a lot of systems, right? So if you look at algorithmic systems, there's a whole set of best practices, continuous build, unit testing, right? Model risk management exists among the more regulated industries for models. They are typically, they might be as simple as Excel models or decision trees, but really something more is needed for ML. And yet you see this void here. You see everybody in a data science class is taught, okay, have some test data, hold it out and test against your model and see and make sure it compares with your training data within a degree and you're good, right? And it's actually way more complicated and way more difficult than that. And that's sort of where our Armilla is coming into play. We're trying to fill that void. Everybody does talk about this as being a multidisciplinary problem, and it is very true. No one system is going to fix this problem. This starts at the policy level. We believe it's more than just good model validation. It also needs some process on top of that. So we're building what I will call a lightweight process for managing a model or AI system through the platform. It includes embedded model validation. It includes best of breed practices that we've learned that are norms in the industry and combine some of our own testing to create a robust system. And there's a feedback loop. So once you take that model validation and you approve it and put something into production, you can validate and see how it's doing. These systems are brittle in the sense that you start throwing new or unexpected data at them and they will change, right? The outcomes, you might be hitting a sensitive region of a model, right? It is a big problem. I will even say it's bigger than everybody here has said it is. That's the scary part. I believe this is an iceberg. We have seen, into the dark corners of many financial institutions, there are thousands of models being deployed. What you see surfaced is probably what's surfaced in the news. There's a whole sea of other models that are bad, that are deployed, that you don't hear about, and that aren't under public scrutiny, right? That is the scary thing. And we really are playing a game of chance when we allow this, right? Like this is really a game of chance. We don't know how, maybe they're all great, right? I find that hard to believe, but the reality is we don't know, right? The industry uses what I will term get out of free jail cards today. And this is part of the problem. There are a lot of get out of free jail cards. There are a lot of excuses for not going under rigorous model validation or for seeing an issue and then still shipping something into production, right? So they might be things like, well, excuses like this is a decision assist only tool, right? So this is a supporting AI system. It gives guidance and then somebody makes the final decision, right? Or this is a non-material model. This is something that doesn't really impact our lives or the lives of our customers, right? Or historically, we've been allowed to do it this way, so we're going to keep doing it this way. Another common one is we don't actually train with things like gender, right? We'll take gender out of the computations. We don't have the data. We don't train against it, or we don't train against ethnicity, and so the data scientists don't need it. You go and build your model. You're actually running blind. It's a problem, meaning you don't know actually if you're biased or not because you don't have access to the data. And we use that as an excuse to say, well, we can't tell if we're biased or not, right? So these are very common. Here's a great example last week in the Toronto Star of a visa screening system, right? And this is a visa screening system that assesses an application, scores it, summarizes it, creates commentary, and then the worker just has to go and copy and paste over the reasons and then deny the application, right? Now, has it undergone rigorous testing? I don't know for certain, but probably not, judging by the article. But their excuse was, it's actually just a decision assist tool, meaning ultimately the immigration officer makes the final decision. This is just helping them, right? So these are very common. These are very common things, and we really have to try to do better, and that might come from policy. It might come from folks on the ground, data scientists themselves saying we need to do better, this might come from business. It's probably it has to come from all directions. I do want to drill into what we do, just one example in our Milla here, just to show you, this is a very common type of problem that we see. A model is biased. Okay, so we start pulling the thread and say, well, where did that bias come from? More often than not, it's coming from the data that it trained against, right? So we go and we look back and we say, okay, the data is biased as well. And then from there we say, well, hold on, we actually didn't train against, in this case, gender, right? How did that bias arise? And often it's correlated variables that it does train against. And so in this case, it turns out that certain housing property types are heavily correlated to gender, and they're heavily correlated to age and ethnicity, right? If you take multi-unit dwellings as a given type. And so if you're training off of that data, probably you're inherently creating biases, right? The other, so, from there becomes this a very difficult discussion. What do you do from there, right? Another way we try to help is really with areas where it gets very complicated. If you look at, for example, some of these approaches that data scientists use to assess their models, like PDPs and ICE plots, they're great, except it's generally one per feature. And some of these models are built against thousands of features, and you can miss things very easily, right? So what we try to do is we try to surface the most interesting ones that might have issues. So for example, this is a 2D PDP. And when you look at 2D PDPs, it's even harder because it's 2 dimensions, 2 features multiplied out, right? It could be 10,000 PDPs, very easy to miss, right? So which are the important ones that might surface issues? And so these are the types of things that really are difficult traditionally that we're trying to make a lot easier. Just real quick, top recommendations, and I went super quick here, but I strongly recommend, and we can talk about this in the discussion, right? I think everybody, myself included, wants more diversity in how we build these out, but shame on you as an organization if you don't catch things, right? If you don't have in place the right processes to catch things. It could be built by all males, it could be built by all females. There are going to be issues, and you still need to have a protective layer, right? And we don't see that a lot of the time. Minimize your use of get out of jail free cards, at least no issues exist, and then consciously decide, right, what to do and how to handle those things. And lastly, this is a real team effort. I'm excited to talk with the panelists because it does require a diversity in thinking. It does require a diversity of approaches as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. And this, I'm very happy that our panel is also very diverse in terms of the topics that was discussed, which is great. So maybe we can go to questions. I have many, but let's see if we have any questions from the audience. If you have, please either turn your microphone or your video on, or if you like to type in the chat, feel free to do so. Valentine, you want to go ahead with your question?
Yes, sure. If there's anyone else, I don't see any hands, and I had a question, and given that, and that would be to all of you, Ebrahim, you included. So if you could, in like 1 or 2 minutes, speaking of governance, Eleni, you're mentioning the importance of governance. That's the field I work in. And so let's say a business comes up to you and says, and that's a little bit what you were talking about, Dan, just earlier, so I can't wait to hear your answer, and I can't wait to hear everybody's answer. Susanna, your approach, thank you so much for presenting that importance of the STEAM-based approach. So I put a paper in the chat on the importance of STEAM-based approaches in the governance of AI. And so my question would be around, so let's say, imagine this business comes up to you, and they're lobbying policymakers and governance decision makers at this point, because there's a lot of new laws. GDPR was adopted a couple of years ago. Right now, they're working on the Data Governance Act and the AI Act in the EU. So let's say business sector or business lobby organization comes up and says, listen, it's too hard or expensive to correct or measure bias in AI. What is your reply? What's your rationale to ensure that in further legislation, bias is measured and corrected? You want to start, Dan? You were on a roll.
Okay, I will start, but you know what? That would be like saying it's really like saying, okay, it's too expensive for me to QA my software system. That's just silly for everybody's sake, right? We do need to get better in how we systematically test and validate AI, absolutely, and we're trying to help. Lots of people are trying to help with that problem, but it's not an excuse, and it's not an acceptable excuse. We can't keep putting customers, clients at risk. And often these are models that don't get surfaced, right? And so it becomes more of this continuous impact that they might not even realize an impact. You have the wrong name, your checks get stopped more, right? Your payments don't get through as often. Like all of these things add up, and without the proper scrutiny, you get less and less trust from the public, and it will backfire. So, that's my last point. It will come back to the industry if we don't do this properly.
So following up on that, the question is, what will come back to the industry? I absolutely love Dan's presentation, and I loved it both because you're saying what's the right thing to do, and you're giving some specific ideas about how to test, which I think is hugely important. But what will come back to industry? I think that unless we have legislation that would make it extremely costly to get caught, the answer of it's too costly to do the test is going to be a valid answer. I think that as a society, we cannot depend on people's morals to do the right thing. There are some things that are too important. We all have our principles, and we can stretch them in different ways. But if you are an organization that has substantial impact on the public good, then you should be responsible for doing things right. And of course, our understanding of right changes. It's not like before software, everybody who was making decisions about loans were moral people in doing the right thing. So I'm sure people were treated badly before by people, and that's partly why we have a problem. However, if you are an organization that proposes a systematic solution that will systematically discriminate against people and systematically violate the good of a big slash of the public, then there should be teeth in legislation to make you pay for it afterwards. It has to be worthwhile to test. And I'm not, I was just so happy and excited when I heard Yosha Benji talk about government. The government has to have some teeth in this business. Otherwise, things will not happen.
I think if you look at the example of like we're going back to your answer, and Lenny, if you look at what happened in the financial markets in the 90s and the 2000s, it did come back to bite. But I mean, who actually really suffered? Who lost their houses? And then only after a whole bunch of damage was caused to society and government had to bail out that industry, did risk management start being implemented in banks.
And this is where the good story was, because honestly, I don't understand this problem very well, and maybe I will say something stupid. But my reading at the time was because Canadian government had much stronger regulations, this is why nobody was becoming so rich in Canada, and our fallout was relatively less than the US.
True.
So,
yeah. Susanna, I wanted to maybe just let you react to my question. What would your rationale be? Because it's not if businesses are saying that and lobbyists saying that, they are. So I wanted to know everybody's answer to that.
Yes, exactly. It's not only that they're saying that, but they are actually saying it internally as well. When you're trying to bring up a bias problem, or when you're trying to, find a solution for it, or, just ask for a pause, until, something that the problem can be solved. They always bring up the question of money and then just say, this is not, scopeable. This is out of scope. This is out of reach. This is too expensive. But at the end, it is going to be more expensive for you in terms of your reputation, in terms of the damage that's done to the community and the lack of trust that you are building up for your company. So I think that's a lousy excuse for people to say, it's not doable, or we won't do that. But it's just, banks have made sure that bank robberies don't happen very often. So they did that. So it's not like you can say, hey, that's not our problem, we will just let bank robberies happen all the time, fine, that's fine. You didn't do that. You took measures to protect yourself. And why is this something new now in AI? It's not. The same things are the same problems, same solutions. It's just time we buckled up and called BS as BS and and have the courage to do that. Whatever platform you are on, to have that courage to do that is what I think is more important. I think Ebrahim.
Thank you. Sorry, I muted myself because I don't want to interrupt Ebrahim, and I just like, I talk so much I could just go on.
No, it's fine.
For an hour, so I muted myself.
No, absolutely. I would just add on to what everyone said. We were thinking about how do you integrate ethics education into an AI program. And so some suggestions that came out was that maybe you need to have a course, maybe you have some hands-on training, maybe you get some hackathons with people in the civil, et cetera, et cetera. And so I had an eye-opening discussion with a colleague in psychology, and he said this issue of ethics is not new. Like, yes, AI is big now, but there's been years of ethics training in other areas. And there's actually literature that shows that more ethics training doesn't actually lead to a more ethical behavior at the end. So it doesn't mean that you pile on like 5 ethics courses, you will have more ethical engineers. Like there is no observed correlation. And I want to take that and kind of generalize it here. And his kind of feedback to me was behavior changes when people are either internally convinced or their governance structures. So you either have policy or you're internally convinced that this is the right thing to do. And I think if you have you can generalize this to organizations as well. Like if you have an organization, you can give them as much ethics training as you want, or do seminars and webinars and talk to the CEOs and whatnot. Change will only happen if the organization internally comes to the realization that this needs to happen. Or you have, as Eleni and others were saying, you have governance structures and policies and rules that ensure that they follow suit. And otherwise, it's just like training AI engineers to be ethical people when they graduate, and they will know about all the loopholes, I would say, but doesn't necessarily make them more ethical. That's my.
Okay. So I agree. I agree. I also agree that there should be the proper governance structures, and I applaud the things like the California Accountability Acts, where you have a right to understand a decision. These are all great things, but my real concern, like, how bad is it? You now can build AI with 1 line of code, right? You can now actually build AI codelessly, right? And so you have people building these systems and they have no idea how they work. And so there is a basic function of educating about what our best practice is. It's no longer sufficient just to have a holdout set and test it, right? So there is a level of which, okay, beyond that, it becomes ethics, but there's also just a set of basic best practices that need to be educated upon them and the greater society, right?
Ebrahim, sorry. Oh, yeah, sorry. After you, Eleni, if we could please let Karthik wrote something really interesting in the chat, and I'd like it to be recorded. So if he could voice it after.
I just wanted to follow up from what Dan said and basically say that it is the responsibility of the academic conferences to not accept papers with improper evaluation. So it's not about ethics, it's about valid testing. I mean, it is about ethics, but before ethics, it's about valid testing, valid findings reporting, and that's our responsibility as academics and educators. And
NeurIPS did that. NeurIPS is the oldest conference on AI, for those who don't know what NeurIPS is. And they have imposed a evaluation of social impact, but they didn't say what that was.
But it's not about social impact.
Chaotic. Yeah.
I don't think it's about social impact. I think you have to hold the technical people feet to the fire and have reports of the results, like Dan said, about basically the impact of multiple feature combinations on the fragility and the, the robustness of the results. And many of the conferences, you see papers that are impossible to replicate, results that do not make sense, and they are appearing in valid conferences. So I'll shut up now.
Okay, Karthik, if you wouldn't mind, please, I would love to hear you say what you wrote in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. This is just an agreement with Eleni saying, absolutely government intervention is required. There are several activities underway. So the EU's Algorithm Accountability Act, the US White House, the current administration has put in place an AI czar whose job it is to figure out how to regulate AI and almost considering the impacts of AI from a fundamental rights perspective. So it's a very interesting concept that they're working with. Having said that, the financial regulatory domain provides a very good template as a starting point. So models in financial services is not new. Regulations such as SR 11.7, E23 in Canada have been around for almost a decade or more. And what they essentially say is if you're going to be a financial service company, if you have a credit lending model, if you have an insurance premium pricing model, there are laws that you have to abide by, and there's ways in which you should validate these models. Those templates exist. And so now we have to think of a way to scale those in a generalized manner, because now that models are being ubiquitous and used in every scenario that we can think of in day-to-day life, I think there's this good starting point that we can go from. But to Eleni's point, I don't think leaving it up to corporates or for-profit organizations to figure this out themselves is going to work. A stick in the form of government intervention has to exist. In fact, just to take that financial services example again, in this summer, Capital One was fined $390 million for not regulating or not testing and validating their anti-money laundering models in the US. So there is a precedence for this. It's not net new. It's just we need to be cognizant of those and emulate it across industry.
Excellent comments, Karthik. I have one question myself for the panel. And so when you think about AI, it's all good if you're thinking about putting AI into, let's say, a factory line, deciding what part is faulty, etc. The problems start when you integrate AI with some aspect of humans, some social aspect. You bring it into hiring decisions, you bring it into personalized search, social networks, etc., etc. And so when it becomes a human thing, it becomes very, very hard to kind of build a model that's fair for all, because fairness means different things to different people, and people want different things, and so on. So what is your take on this integration of AI and humans, and what does fairness being defined from a technical point of view in many different ways, but in a kind of a social perspective, what do you think a fair ethical AI model that integrates with humans would look like at the end of the day? Susanna, you want to take that one?
I think it is it's about how we all live, like, within this ecosystem, we are all surviving. We have things that, we need for our survival that we take, and then things that, we live in the environment that is excess for us to take. So, but in AI, that is not the the way it works. It's actually growing at a speed and a scale that is almost like a cancer, and it's like every problem in the world has a technological solution. That's not how it is. Every problem in the world does not need AI and does not need a technological solution. And it's this ability to see that and to live within your ecosystem, to grow within that, and to grow at a level that is sustainable for the ecosystem itself. I think we need to come to that understanding, and that understanding has to come within those organizations. But this kind of talk is just only done in conferences. But when you work in a tech company, this is called fluff. This is called, you just don't, this is great. This is a philosophical conversation. Let's have a coffee chat about it, but not in practical, practical implementation is done. But if you, in order to answer your previous question also, the more ethics you learn, you don't become ethical. This is also true in psychology. The more you learn about biases, all the cognitive biases, you become actually more biased, not not the other way around. So there is I teach a course on cognitive biases. At the end, I tell them about the endowment bias. The endowment bias means that you are the most dangerous person now, because now you know about all the biases. You will think you are more educated on this than the average human out there. This is same for even in ethics education, I believe. The only way that we can counteract this is to have follow the models that have worked for centuries. Take finance, take medical, medicine. All those industries have ethics. They had incentives. They also had regulations. They had punishments. We don't have planes falling out of the sky every day. There is a reason for that. We don't have people, doctors killing patients every day. There's a all of those industries were able to innovate, and they had incentives as well as regulations. So I think we need to find that mix in there, and I hope that answered both of your questions.
Yes, thank you. Go ahead, Eleni.
Okay, so I want us to think a little bit about, I believe that I agree with Susanna that not everything needs a technical solution, but I also believe on the flip side that technology can address many of our challenges. And I think my first point was about systematization. We have processes, and right now many of our processes depending on what culture you live in. There is bartering, there is negotiation, there is quid pro quo. And all of these problems were nicely hidden because they were small in scale. So small unfairnesses are easy to hide. And I think our environment and our society has always been suffering from unfairness. It's just a matter of scope and systematization that makes it problematic. So I don't think that AI is a bad thing in that. I think that codification, systematization can solve unfairness problems. I don't want somebody to make a decision about whether I get a loan just because I have a weird accent. And this has happened to people I know. They couldn't get a house because they had a weird name and weird accent. So anyway, the point is that unfairness exists. Our society will be, we as individuals will have biases because they work. Basically, we develop biases and stereotypes because they're sort of simplifying our decision-making process. And we are biologically instrumented to oversimplify a decision. I see something, I know the answer, I'm not going to think through it. So it's all of these issues are just too big to be addressed in a simple manner. And I think that what we have to do as a technology to keep on being aware of that and develop technological solutions to address the problems that technology is bringing forward. So now we understand some cases. We know that, for example, CHR has very good rules about how to incorporate sex and gender. Because before, people were not testing on women because women have menstrual cycles and that screws up the hormones and the results are not nice and clean. So they wouldn't develop drugs using women as subjects because the science was difficult. Now CHR says you have to. I mean, there are women around, so you have to test your drugs. So this is good science fixing a specific health problem. And similar problems exist in different domains, and I very much like Kartik's point about the financial sector has this. We need to develop highly technical solutions in different domains to address the problem that systematic AI-related software brings to these domains. And I think it's, I mean, we can do it. I think it's just something that we
Melanie,
have to.
I'm sorry. As the chair, I am going to be the rude one and timekeeper. We have a keynote speaker starting at 3:30. It's 3:22 by 3:25. So if I could ask you to just wrap up in a couple seconds, maybe let Dan speak for a couple last second, and Ebrahim maybe wrap up so that 3:25 we can turn the screens off for just 5 minutes so I can run and get a glass of water and then welcome our next speaker, please. Thank you. And
Sure.
thank you very much, everybody.
I'll just say real quick, yeah, thanks. On your question there, my view is that there are a lot of these decision assist tools, right? And you can't use the get out of free jail card for them, right? The reality is that the equilibrium for some of these, if you think of the HR hiring problem, right? That actually they reinforce biases because you're not seeing women being applying, you're filtering all the women out from applying. They're not getting jobs, therefore the tool learns that you're not hiring women, right? That's a bad equilibrium to be in. So even if it's a decision assist tool, they still need to pass through that level of rigor, you know, to work with humans. And that's my simplified answer. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I just like to end my own kind by saying my own experience. This is a very, very difficult topic. And I think what Valentine, you're doing with everyone else here, a kind of interdisciplinary view of the problem, bringing different people from different perspectives, not only AI people, not only technical computer science people, but people from outside who really deeply understand these more social problems rather than AI or technical problems, and addressing them. And I, as a person who works in AI computer science, I think we're very clueless on how to address these. You know, we build these technical models to address something, but those may actually be intensifying the problems that already exist, giving, as Susanna was saying, giving us a false sense of hope and enthusiasm and that we're doing something, but we may be breaking some more. So thank you very much, everyone, for the excellent panel. I wish we had a couple of more hours time, but everything good, I guess, ends very quickly. So back to you, Valentine, and thank you, everyone.